It all started with a knock on my hotel room in the middle of the night. Little did I know it would change everything, forever. The knock was soft, almost hesitant, pulling me from the haze of my thoughts. I'd been sitting by the window, staring out at the city lights below, a glass of wine untouched on the table beside me. The hotel room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioner and the occasional distant honk of a car. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the stem of the wine glass. "Who is it?" I called, though I already knew. "It's me." Davis's voice came through the door, low and uncertain. "Can I come in?" I set the glass down and stood, smoothing the wrinkles from my dress as if it mattered. The room felt too warm suddenly, the air thick with something I couldn't name. I opened the door, and there he was, standing in the dimly lit hallway, his hands shoved into the pockets of his hoodie. His hair was tousled, like he'd been running his fingers through it, and his eyes, those deep, familiar eyes, were shadowed with something I couldn't quite place. Before we continue, if you are feeling generous, please subscribe to our channel so we can be able to bring you more stories like this. "Hey," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I couldn't sleep. I stepped aside, letting him in. The scent of his cologne, something warm and woodsy, filled the space as he brushed past me. He lingered near the bed, his shoulders tense, his gaze darting around the room like he was searching for something to anchor him. "Do you want to sit?" I asked, gesturing to the armchair by the window. He shook his head, instead perching on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. I closed the door and leaned against it, studying him. He looked so much like his father in that moment, the same strong jawline, the same way of holding himself like he was carrying the weight of the world. But there was a vulnerability in him that his father had never shown, a rawness that made my chest ache. Sam, Davis's father, my late husband, had passed away in a road accident a few years ago at a time like this. His anniversary was around the corner. "It's been 3 years," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 years since he died." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know." He looked up at me then, his eyes glistening in the soft light. "Do you ever feel like you're just stuck? Like you're still waiting for something to change, but it never does?" I crossed the room and sat beside him, careful to leave enough space between us. "Every day," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "But that's why I suggested this trip. I thought maybe getting away would help us both." He let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if it's helping. I just feel, I don't know, lost." I reached out instinctively, placing a hand on his arm. His skin was warm beneath my fingers, and I could feel the tension in his muscles, the way he seemed to be holding himself together by sheer willpower. "Davis," I said softly, "you're not alone in this. I'm here. I'll always be here." He turned to look at me, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but instead he leaned forward, resting his forehead against my shoulder. His breath was warm against my neck, and I could feel the faint tremor in his body as he exhaled. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he murmured, his voice muffled against my skin. I hesitated, my hand hovering above his back before I finally let it rest there. "You don't have to find out," I whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. The room seemed to shrink around us, the walls closing in until it felt like there was no world outside this moment, outside the two of us. Finally, he pulled away, his eyes meeting mine. There was something in his gaze, something raw and unfiltered, that made my breath catch. "Edith," he began, his voice trembling, "I need to tell you something. Something I've been trying to ignore for a long time." My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo in my ears. I wanted to stop him, to tell him that some things were better left unsaid, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, bracing myself for what was coming. He took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I don't think of you as just my stepmom, Edith. I haven't for a long time. If I'm being honest, even long before Dad passed away," he said in a combination of faint honesty and vulnerability. The air seemed to leave the room, leaving me gasping for breath. I stared at him, my mind racing, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Davis," I whispered, my voice breaking. This isn't right. He shook his head, his eyes pleading. I know it's complicated. I know it's messed up, but I can't keep pretending. I can't keep hiding how I feel. I stood abruptly, putting distance between us. My hands were trembling, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. You're confused, I said, my voice firmer now. You're grieving, and you're lonely, and you're looking for something to hold on to. But this isn't it. He stood too, his expression hardening. I know I'm grieving Edith, but I also know what I'm saying. I know it's not easy, but it's been heavy on my chest. I had to say it. I turned away, wrapping my arms around myself as if I could shield myself from the weight of his words. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in on me from all sides. I wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. Davis, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. This can't happen. It can't. He didn't respond, and when I turned back to face him, he was already heading for the door. He paused with his hand on the knob, his shoulders slumped. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I didn't mean to make things harder. And then he was gone, leaving me standing there in the silence, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a soft glow over the hotel room. I sat at the small table by the window, a cup of coffee cooling in front of me. My stomach was in knots, the events of the previous night replaying in my mind like a broken record. A knock at the door startled me, and I knew exactly who it was. I hesitated. Then, come in, I called, my voice steadier than I felt. The door creaked open, and Davis stepped inside. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed and his hair disheveled, as if he hadn't slept. Hey, he said quietly. Hey, I replied, my voice just as soft. Do you want some coffee? He shook his head, stepping further into the room. The scent of his cologne, subtle and familiar, drifted toward me, mingling with the faint aroma of the coffee. He sat down across from me, his gaze fixed on the table. I'm sorry about last night, he said after a moment. I didn't mean to make things weird. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. It's not that simple, Davis. What you said, it changes things. He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. I know, and I'm not asking for anything. I needed you to know how I feel. I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I reached across the table, placing my hand over his. This isn't something we can just ignore. It's complicated, but we will figure it out together, I said, my voice breaking. I recognized the vulnerability in his eyes, and I wanted to reassure him that everything would be okay. He looked down at my hand, his expression unreadable. I don't want to lose you, he murmured. How can we go back to the way things were? He asked earnestly. I smiled at him warmly, cognizant of how hard he was striving just to have this conversation. Maybe we don't have to, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Maybe we just figure it out as we go. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his words hanging between us. The sound of a distant elevator ding and the faint hum of voices from the hallway seeped into the room, a reminder of the world outside our bubble. Finally, I stood, grabbing my jacket from the back of the chair. Let's get out of here, I said. We can't just sit in this room all day. The hotel lobby was bustling with activity, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifting from the nearby cafe. We stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing against our faces. The city was alive with the hum of traffic and the chatter of pedestrians, but it all felt distant, like background noise. I held his hand as we stepped outside, and something felt different. I felt alive. Davis looked at me, his warm eyes piercing through mine. I smiled at him. The air felt full with promise, with adventure. The next few days passed in a blur. We explored the city, visiting museums and cafes, trying to find some semblance of normalcy. There were moments of laughter, of connection, but the tension was always there, lurking beneath the surface. One evening, we found ourselves on the hotel rooftop, the city lights spread out before us like a sea of stars. The air was cool, the faint scent of rain lingering in the breeze. We sat side by side, our shoulders brushing, the silence between us comfortable for the first time in days. Thank you, Davis said suddenly, his voice soft, for not giving up on me. I turned to look at him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his eyes. I could never give up on you, I said. You're my family. It's beautiful, Davis said quietly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It is, I agreed, though I wasn't looking at the view. I was looking at him. The way the light caught in his hair, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the way his breath seemed to hitch when he caught me staring. Davis, I began. He didn't let me finish. I'm not sure what took hold of him. Maybe it was the heaviness of the day, the unspoken tension crackling between us, or the intoxicating scent of rain lingering in the air. But before I could think, he closed the space between us, his lips brushing mine. His skin was warm, my breath catching as he leaned in. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like we were both testing the waters. But then his hands dropped to my waist, pulling me closer, and the world seemed to fall away. It was a kiss filled with everything we hadn't said, the fear, the longing, the hope, and for a moment it felt like we were the only two people in the world. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. I'm scared, he whispered, his voice breaking. Me too, I admitted, my heart pounding. But we'll figure it out, together. That night we slept in my room. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words and lingering touches. We lay side by side in the dark, the space between us charged with something neither of us could name. His hand brushed mine, and I didn't pull away. His fingers intertwined with mine, and I held on tight. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. What we felt was enough. When we returned home, the rhythm of our lives felt jarring after the calm we had shared on our trip. We had not brought ourselves to talk about the kiss on the roof or the intimate night we had shared thereafter. The house was quieter now, its usual hum of life muffled by the weight of what was left unsaid. The nights were long, filled with silence, and I found myself lying awake in bed, trying to settle my racing thoughts. The taste of his kiss still lingered on my lips, haunting me, reminding me that things had changed. It wasn't that I didn't want to talk about it. I knew we needed to, but the words felt too heavy, too fragile, as though any attempt to speak them would shatter the delicate thread we were hanging on. Instead, we moved around each other with care, pretending that nothing had changed when it had. We did what we always did. I made dinner, he did his shifts at his job, played basketball, and hung out with his friends, and we exchanged the occasional pleasantry. But every time I caught his gaze, or when our fingers brushed in passing, it was there, between us, that unspoken tension, that fragile space where everything we hadn't said floated, waiting. One morning, I was in the kitchen, brewing coffee, when the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway made me freeze for a moment. "Davis," I said, my voice soft, though I wasn't sure why I had said his name like that, like a question I didn't yet know the answer to. He didn't respond right away. The silence stretched, thick and palpable, until I felt him stop just beside me. His presence loomed over me in a way that made the air feel heavier, like he was waiting for something, and so was I. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost tentative. "Are you okay?" he asked. I searched his eyes, trying to read his mind. The sincerity and warmth in his eyes made my heart soften, a sense of parental love weaving through my body. "Yes, I'm okay, dear. You've been busy with basketball lately. How are Trevor and Clint?" I inquired about his life, trying to sound calm and not particularly keen to know how his friends were doing. "We need to talk," he said, ignoring my question as if reading my mind. The words hung in the air like an inevitability, and I nodded, even though every part of me wanted to avoid it. His eyes were tired, but there was something else there, something that made my pulse quicken, a heaviness I couldn't ignore. "About?" I asked, even though I already knew. I needed him to say it, to break the silence that had been suffocating us. "About the kiss," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "About everything that's been left hanging between us." I could feel my chest tighten, a mix of dread and something else, something I wasn't ready to face. I placed my cup down on the counter, suddenly aware of how steady my hands were despite the turmoil in my gut. "We don't have to talk about it, Davis," I said, though my words felt hollow, even to me. "We've moved past it." But he didn't buy it. He reached for me then, his hand brushing mine, a fleeting touch that burned me more than I expected. "I can't move past it," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Not when it's still there, between us. It's not just the kiss, Edith, it's everything. the way we've been pretending like nothing has changed. I swallowed hard. His words struck me like a lightning bolt, cutting through the calm I'd tried to preserve. I wanted to pull away, to protect myself, but his hand, warm and firm against mine, grounded me in a way I didn't understand. I couldn't turn away from this conversation. Not now, not when the truth had finally risen to the surface. "Edith," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "how do you really feel? I need to know. I can't keep pretending like we're just..." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting his words wash over me. I had wanted to ignore it, to pretend I could just slide back into the life I knew before, but I couldn't anymore. Not with him standing there, so vulnerable, so open. The truth came rushing to the surface in a flood I couldn't stop. "I'm scared because I don't know what happens if we acknowledge this thing between us," I confessed, the words slipping out before I could stop them. There was a long pause, and then he stepped closer, closing the distance between us in one smooth motion. His hand cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing over my skin with a tenderness that took my breath away. "Well, here we are. We have to decide for ourselves what happens," he murmured, his lips brushing my forehead. "I'm not scared," he continued. I felt my heart beat faster, the weight of his words sinking deep into my bones. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of peace settle in me. We didn't have all the answers, we didn't know what the future held, but we had this moment, this fragile, uncertain moment, and that was enough. I leaned forward and kissed him, but this time it was different. There was no hesitation, no walls between us, just the soft, familiar heat of his lips against mine. The air felt charged, carrying with it the weight of everything unsaid. The warmth I had felt between us on the trip, the connection we shared in those stolen moments, came rushing back, and this time I didn't hold back. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer. I felt the steady beat of his heart, mirroring my own. It was as though time itself slowed. The world outside us disappeared completely. The gentle press of his body against mine, the way his hands moved with a tenderness I hadn't realized I craved, drew me further in. There was nothing between us now, no hesitation, no walls. Everything that had held us back, every fear, every doubt, melted away in that quiet, charged moment. His breath against my neck sent a shiver down my spine, and as I pulled him closer, I felt the unmistakable heat between us intensify. Being there in that moment felt exhilarating, something full of longing. We were finally letting ourselves be vulnerable, giving ourselves over to something we had both been too afraid to acknowledge. In the living room, on the couch, as our bodies aligned, as we moved together in a rhythm that was entirely our own, I felt a quiet, overwhelming sense of peace settle in me. For the first time since our return, I finally felt like I could breathe again, fully, completely with him. I was in the kitchen making dinner the next day when Davis wandered in, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and without a word, he began washing the rice in the sink. The sound of running water and the rhythmic thud of the knife against the cutting board filled the silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. "You know," he said after a while, his voice light, "you never let me help with dinner before." I glanced at him, a small smile tugging at my lips. "That's because you used to burn everything." He laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I've gotten better." "Prove it," I teased, nodding toward the stove. "You're in charge of the stir-fry." He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, stepping up to the stove with a confidence that made me smile. As he cooked, I watched him out of the corner of my eye, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he hummed softly under his breath. It was such a simple moment, but it felt significant, like we were building something new together. When we sat down to eat, our knees brushed under the table, and neither of us moved away. The food was good, better than good, actually, and as we ate, we talked about nothing and everything, the conversation flowing easily between us. In the weeks that followed, intimate dinners and movie nights became a regular thing. We'd curl up on the couch, a bowl of popcorn between us, and lose ourselves in whatever film we'd chosen. It wasn't just about the movies, though. It was about the way Davis would stretch his arm across the back of the couch, his fingers brushing against my shoulder. It was about the way I'd lean into him, my head resting against his chest as the film played on. One night, Halfway through a rom-com that neither of us would admit we were enjoying, Davis hit pause, his hand lingering on the remote. His gaze was serious when he turned toward me. "Do you think Dad would have liked this?" he asked, his voice unusually quiet. "The movie, I mean," he added, just to clarify. I blinked, surprised by the question, but not uncomfortable with it. It was one of those moments where the weight of our past hung heavily between us. The unspoken irony of the situation not lost on me. "Probably not," I said with a soft chuckle. He always said rom-coms were too predictable. Davis smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes, an old, familiar sadness that appeared at the mention of his father. Yeah, he used to say that about everything, though. He hated anything that didn't keep him guessing. I felt a pang in my chest, reaching out instinctively to place a hand on his arm. The touch was more for me than him, a grounding gesture, as if to remind both of us that some things, like this connection we had, were still real. "He'd be proud of you, you know, of the person you've become," I added. Davis looked at me, his expression softening, but there was a hint of something uncertain behind his eyes. "You think so?" I swallowed, trying to steady the lump in my throat. "I know so," I said firmly, even though my own words felt strange in my mouth. And as much as I wanted to believe his father would approve, I couldn't shake the irony of the situation. The man who had once been my husband, who had raised Davis to be the man he was, would never have imagined this. He would never have approved of the tangled, complicated relationship between his son and me. "He loved you, Davis," I added reassuringly. Davis didn't say anything, but his gaze softened, and without a word, he leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead. The moment felt tender, a shared understanding in the quiet act. He didn't pull away immediately, his face lingering just close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. Then he unpaused the movie, the soft hum of the film filling the silence between us. We didn't talk about his father again that night, but the moment lingered, a quiet acknowledgement of the past that didn't overshadow the present. A few weeks later, we went to visit Sam's grave together. It was a crisp, clear morning, the kind where the air feels fresh and alive. We stood side by side, our hands brushing as we looked down at the headstone. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then finally, Davis broke the silence. "I miss him," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me too," I replied, my throat tight. "But I think he'd understand about us." Davis glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "You really think so?" I nodded, reaching for his hand. "He loved us both, and he'd want us to be happy, even if it's not how he imagined." He squeezed my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think you're right." We stayed there for a while longer, the silence between us comfortable, before heading back to the car. Over the next few months, our relationship continued to evolve. There were moments of intimacy, soft kisses in the kitchen, lingering touches as we passed each other in the hallway, but there was also a deeper sense of comfort. We were intentional about it, about building something that felt real and lasting. One evening, as we lay in bed, Davis turned to me, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever feel guilty?" he asked. I knew what he was asking, and I didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," I admitted finally, "but not about how I feel about you." He nodded, his hand finding mine under the covers. "I do too sometimes, but I would not change a thing between us." He smiled, a small, tentative thing, and leaned in to kiss me. It was soft and slow, a reassurance of the companionship we'd found in each other. And as I drifted off to sleep that night, his arm draped over my waist, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. If you like this story, give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Also, do leave us a comment below. See you in the next one.